Good morning. Welcome to another session of #LDeduchat Leadership Development in Education Online. Today we have the fantastic Sam Strickland. No introductions really needed, but I will do a full intro for you later on today. We'll be discussing getting the cultures right in our schools. Sam's spoken quite a lot about this topic. He has so much to say and so many insights into how we can get the school cultures in general, and also I think with the current situation, how we move out of it. I'm sure we'll be touching on that too. We are active on Twitter. We've got Melanie Norman today from Cedars Upper School in Later Buzzard, who will be doing a Twitter takeover on our @Chiltern TSA Twitter. Do join in there if you're active on there as well. The discussions will be happening during the session as well as afterwards. So without further ado, I'm now going to share Sam's presentation for you on getting the culture right within our schools.
So this session is all about behaviour, and it's thinking about the research that underpins behaviour. I'm going to try and pose a number of questions around behaviour for you to consider and to think about, and then to suggest strategies with which you can try and drive behaviour within your own setting. And really the starting point is this key question of what are you permitting? What is it that is permissible in your environment, your classroom, your school, your faculty, your department, etc. Some referral points that you might want to look at in more detail, and for those of you watching this, you may be familiar with these, but Tom Bennett's Creating a School Culture, which is freely available on Google if you do a Google search, about a 92-ish page long document, but it really talks about what creates a really strong school culture, having looked at well over 300 schools. Doug Lemob's Teach Like a Champion book, I think, is exceptional. It gives you lots of advice, lots of guidance on teaching strategies, teaching approaches that can help to contribute to a positive culture for learning within a classroom setting. Tom Sherrington, within the last 12 months, wrote about Rosenshine, which I appreciate is a model and an ideal from quite a while ago now in kind of the grand scheme of things. But actually, Tom's kind of distillation of that is really, really useful and puts the whole kind of model into a really kind of user-friendly format, which again can help to drive behaviour. And then the Educational Endowment Fund, the EEF, they have released a series of behaviour interventions that, again, against the research that they've undertaken, have actually been quite successful in driving behaviour within schools. So some of the issues in and around behaviour, I mean, the first point, which I think is so pertinent, is the amount of support, the amount of CPD, the amount of training that we actually receive around behaviour can actually be quite minimal. And there's often an assumption that staff can just do behaviour. And in a number of schools, it's kind of just left to chance. It's left to the teachers to drive. Even I think about my own teacher training, which I appreciate in real terms now is quite a while ago. There was a 1-hour workshop which focused on the use of palms down and raising your eyebrows and how to project your voice. Great, that's not enough. Equally, another issue is that quite a significant number of teachers think that behaviour is an issue, that it's not good enough in our schools. And probably the most important bit is that actually a lot of our behaviour management in schools is reactive. It's not proactive, it's not preemptive. It tends to respond to an event, to a problem, to an issue after it's happened. And actually we could probably prevent a lot of the problems we see in schools through being incredibly proactive. This, I would argue, is huge, and that's that poor behaviour really is kryptonite to a school. It's kryptonite to the culture, the climate, the ethos, staff retention, staff morale, staff workload, and to staff, to pupils' learning and to outcomes as well. And to my mind, I would argue that positive behaviour, a positive culture is actually the most important school improvement driver. We can talk about the curriculum, and I'm a huge advocate of the curriculum. We can talk about curriculum intent. We can talk about the enacted curriculum in classrooms. All kind of meaningless though if the culture of a school isn't secure and isn't where it needs to be. All those other things really then become, well, everything really in general sense becomes left to chance. A positive approach to behaviour and positive behaviour in its broadest sense will define your culture. It will absolutely allow pupils to academically thrive. It will allow staff the time to think about the curriculum in its fullest sense, to upskill themselves as classroom practitioners, to think about their subject knowledge. For our most disadvantaged, most disaffected pupils, it does actually help to reverse the Matthew effect, because so much of their lesson time isn't being wasted through poor behaviour and teachers' attention being distracted by the things that actually get in the way of learning, as in poor behaviour. Equally, in terms of recruiting, retaining staff, it's an enormous factor in terms of staff well-being. Behaviour is huge, but equally it's also going to help to recruit pupils to your school. Schools that may well be below pan may well, I'm not saying this is always the case, have behavioural issues. So it serves, kind of more importantly, as a massive piece of marketing for your school. The power of word of mouth should never, ever be underestimated. And if your culture is strong, parents will articulate that, to other parents, and then other parents and other parents, and it has a huge snowballing effect. I would argue this is the starting point really with behaviour, which is you permit what you promote and you promote what you permit. And that starts from the top with the head, all the way down to kind of, in a school's hierarchy, the lowest level within a school. And I know that's quite a crude way of thinking about things. But as a head, as a principal, if for sake of argument, one of your policies is that pupils should have their shirts tucked in, and you see a group of pupils with their shirts untucked, and you walk past and you don't interject and intervene and ask pupils to resolve that, then you are in effect allowing that to happen, but you're also signalling to everybody that rule, that policy doesn't really count, doesn't really matter. That can be really, really damaging. So whatever you stand for from the top, you have to drive. A real key aspect, and something for you to think about and to ponder, and if we were doing this as a live training session, I would ask you to discuss this perhaps with other colleagues. But actually, what is your school culture like? What is it that you can see the minute you drive into the car park, walk through the front door into reception, walking through the corridors, go into classrooms? What is the actual culture? What does it say about your school? And the vision for behaviour is that good behaviour, ultimately, it requires a lot of effort. It requires endless follow through. I think we've got to take a view that all teachers can improve and that all teachers can teach. I don't really subscribe to the view that teachers are useless at their jobs. I also think it's really important that you've got a clear set of strategies and a clear routine for learning, and that is so important in terms of driving a culture and behaviour. And probably the most important bit is that you don't fall foul of tricks and gimmicks and fads that will last maybe a day. Everyone sees a benefit for 24 hours, and then the next day it all falls apart, because actually what you've engaged in has no credibility or substance to it when you're dealing with behaviour. So thinking about the factors that actually cause poor behaviour, and I'm not going to read every kind of slide to you, boredom features quite highly, but actually probably the biggest thing that causes poor behaviour is poor behaviour. And I know that sounds kind of contradictory or bizarre, but it's about the social norm within your school. If the social norm is to misbehave and nothing happens as a consequence, that behaviour isn't corrected, isn't reprimanded, there isn't potentially a punitive sanction, then more and more bad behaviour will manifest. And equally, if there is a lack of routine, that will cause poor behaviour within a school. So then what actually drives positive behaviour? It's driven by a number of factors. It starts at the top with the head and the senior management team. It's driven by middle leaders, it's driven by teachers, and it's driven by all staff. And any study that looks at a positive, driving positive behaviour will tell you that you've got to change the social norm within a school, especially amongst teenagers. Teenagers are an incredibly conformist age range within society. And whatever kind of the alpha within a teenage group does, if it's okay to get away with it or do it, then other people will follow. We've also got to try and make it cool to behave, to do the right things. And that isn't easy at all. But equally within that, you've got to stretch and challenge pupils, but make that stretching and challenging achievable so that success is achievable. Because actually, ultimately, pupils want to succeed. Even if they tell you they don't, ultimately, they really do. And there are misconceptions around behaviour as well. A key misconception is that good planning results in good behaviour. And this is often pushed through a lot of the training that we receive. And I would challenge that. I could have the best, most meticulously planned sequence of lessons in the world, with David Beckham coming in to do kick-me-ups and the Pope to give a powerful motivational speech. If the culture isn't right, nobody will listen. And that will just fall foul completely on deaf ears. Another misconception is that poor behaviour is the teacher's fault. It's down to you. You've allowed that to happen. And that can manifest itself in a kind of natural selection process within schools. And you get the hero teachers, the ones that stand out from the rest, who can teach really well, because actually it's about their charisma as opposed to actually their quality as a teacher. And that can be quite dangerous. Another misconception is that SLT, the senior leadership team, don't really have a role with behaviour. It isn't for them. Or you get the sacrificial lamb within the senior team, that there's one person who is the kind of de facto behaviour guru and the rest of the senior team can hide away in their offices. That can be quite a dangerous approach. Thinking as well that behaviour isn't my responsibility, I'm just here to do this. It's everybody's responsibility within a school. And those classic lines of "they behave for me," which goes back to that whole idea of teacher natural selection. Another misconception is this whole idea of having structure and systems and routines kind of killing freedom for thought and killing imagination within schools. It's quite the reverse, actually. Having a structure, having a routine actually empowers and allows greater freedom, because when things become habitual and pupils and teachers engage in the same set of routines, you're then able to free up thinking space, your working memory, to do other things that, actually the fun things, which are the learning. There's a number of features or common features of the most successful schools. This kind of goes around in a similar cycle, really, of real highly visible senior leaders. That is so key. The visibility of the senior team, all the way from the top being the principal. A real clarity of culture and the communication that sits behind that as well. That the same messages are repeated and repeated and repeated. The whole idea of you say something once in a staff briefing or a staff training session, or worse still through an email, and then think that you've achieved it because you said it once, is where things often go wrong. You have to communicate and recommunicate and over-communicate your message to make it basically common currency across a school. Having extremely high expectations, sky-high expectations, but they have to be livable, breathable. They're part of the DNA and the fabric of your school. Equally, to have a high level of support. And I've deliberately put this again, that whole idea of well-communicated expectations as well. They tend to be the features of the absolute powerhouse schools across the country who've got really deeply entrenched and strong cultures. Importantly, though, nothing's actually left to chance. And behaviour itself, in many regards, is a subject in its own right. It's something that has to be taught. And routines for learning are something that have to be taught and taught and taught, again, until they become habitual. And kind of a starting or series of starting points with this are, what actually is the culture that you want to achieve? How do you communicate this? And then how do you teach it? And then how do you maintain it? So in terms of that first part, the culture that you want, this will sound very MPQ SL or MPQH in kind of approach. And there's a reason why the MPQs do this very early on within the programs. And that's to get you to think about your vision, your values, your mission statement, because that becomes, or it should become, a livable, breathable document that actually becomes part of the DNA of a school. It's not just something that's sat on a shelf or sat on a website. It needs to be something that every single stakeholder believes in, buys into, and lives and breathes. So it's important to spend, I would say, a considerable amount of time thinking about what the culture is, within your setting that you want it to be. You then need to think, I would argue, about the lines in the sand. What are you going to tolerate? And what will you not tolerate? And what are going to be the consequences for those? That's not meant to sound zero tolerance in approach. I would actually argue that everybody has a form of zero tolerance, and every head teacher, whether they claim to be a zero tolerance head or not, have got an aspect of ZT, zero tolerance, within them. I can't imagine there would be a head in the country that would credibly stand up and say that they're happy that bullying or fighting or swearing at staff takes place in their school. But more importantly is, what are you going to do about it? If you're not prepared to deal with those, to have those things in your establishment, what will you do as the consequence for those? And some sort of kind of questions to really consider in terms of the whole school approach, because I would argue that in terms of driving behaviour, it needs to be whole school. There needs to be a real steer from what I call the mothership to the satellites. So exclusions, do you have them? Do you not? Do you believe in them? Do you not? And if you do or don't, how do you communicate that to your stakeholders? How do you run detentions across your school? Are they centralised? Are they disparately spread across the satellites within the school, to departments, to different faculty areas, to subject teachers? Is there a systemised approach to how you do those? Do you have an isolation system? Do you use booths? Do you use staff offices for isolation? Do you not? How do you lay classrooms out? Some schools will have classrooms laid out very much as the teacher would like, so it's very different from one room to the next. Other schools will insist that everybody's sat in groups, and some schools will insist that pupils are sat in rows. How do you transition pupils from lessons? Do you do that in silence? Do you have lineups? How do they go into assembly? Do you have an on-call system as well for when there are problems across the school with duty staff? What's the approach that you take towards rewards? How do you engage parents as another key stakeholder in your behaviour system? And what do you do about pupil equipment? Is that something you want pupils to take responsibility for themselves, or is that something that you will drive as an establishment of school? Then rules. What do you do with your rules as a school? How explicit do you make these? There's an educationist from America called Mazzano, and he talks about there being kind of the optimum is 4 rules in any one school setting or establishment. And the ones that he cites are here on the screen, which is to have quiet when the teacher is talking. And I have an issue with the word quiet. I think quiet leads to quite a lot of ambiguity because my definition of quiet and your definition of quiet may well be very, very different. I think either talking or silence means something. Either you want pupils to talk or you don't. Quiet can mean different things to different people. But again, in terms of the rules that Mazzano puts forward, those 4 are clearly there. And by and large, I don't think many people would probably disagree with most of that. In my own school setting, we've got a classroom code of conduct built around 3 really clear and over-communicated rules. And that's really, really deliberate because I want complete clarity and complete consistency across my school. And I allow staff to use this graphic, which is in every classroom, as a script for when they are dealing with behaviour. So they depersonalise it and talk solely about the behaviour and not the pupil. But routines ultimately should become a behaviour in themselves, which is completely standardised and becomes an habitual routine that everybody engages in the same way, at the same time, in the same manner, in the same fashion. And having routines can be a really preemptive, proactive way of dealing with poor behaviour in a school. Then you need to think about how you're going to teach and define your routines. How do you want pupils entering lessons? How do you want them going into assemblies? How do you want them walking the corridors, transitioning from lesson to lesson? How do you want them leaving your school site? How do you want them to ask for help in lessons? And what do you want the cultural classroom social norm to be? You need to define all of that, I would argue, if you're going to be proactive in your approach towards behaviour as a school. And then communication is absolutely key within all of this. How do you describe those norms to your pupils? What language do you use? And I would argue you want to be using language that depersonalises the behaviour and makes it about the behaviour and the institution. So you are not behaving in our, against our expectations. This is not how we would behave in this particular school. Again, how do you use assemblies to communicate your behavioural expectations? How do the adults also behave within the school? How do they role model the behaviour that you want as an establishment? And again, that has to come from the top. And the displays around the school, do they reinforce your culture and your ethos and your expectations and your routines, or do they not? Equally, how do you platform pupils that do all the right things? How do you use that to reinforce the culture that you're trying to drive? And explicitly, how do you actually train the pupils to engage in the behaviours that you want? And this is the key though. You really do need to train the staff and you need to train the pupils in the behaviours that you want. And it's about modelling it, collectively practicing it and repeating it and doing that over and over and over. I think there needs to be an acceptance as well that at times you need to reboot your behaviour, to reboot your culture, your climate, to recalibrate things where there are bumps in the roads, because inevitably there are in schools, but it's following that same kind of format that you will model it, you'll train, you'll practice, you'll repeat. And ultimately, those routines will define your school's social norm. Another thing to think about as well is who was your best teacher at school and why? And whenever I've delivered this in a live setting, you tend to get the same kind of answers back. Somebody that was motivational, inspirational, they knew their subject, they cared about us, they were strict but warm, they were friendly, they were firm but fair, whatever kind of phrases you want to use, tends to be roughly around the same kind of things. I guess what we really need to think about is how the class teacher is also the architect of their class culture. And for a teacher to be successful with their pupils in terms of having the right classroom culture, they need to front load their expectations. They need to make it really, really clear from the outset what their expectations are of their classroom environment, because they are the owner of that classroom. They need to repeat those expectations and they need to train the pupils in what they expect and to always follow through on what they want and how they want it. At times, I think it's fair that a teacher might stop an activity completely and recalibrate a class. And at times, a teacher may well need to tactically ignore, but then ultimately tactically follow up on an issue if, again, the teacher being the expert, they feel that by interjecting with a pupil, that might cause the whole class to descend into chaos. What I would say, though, is that teachers should never condone rudeness. That there isn't a place for that in our schools, I would argue, but also to try and use a very clear blend of positive approaches and a routine-driven approach to their teaching that leads to a degree of consistency and continuity for pupils to feel safe. And this is key. The most successful teachers in terms of behaviour and generating a positive classroom culture will nip issues in the bud. They won't let them fester for weeks or months on end. And then a few strategies, kind of takeaways really, that you can use with pupils. And this is by no means exhaustive, but a few approaches that you can take to give you kind of a flavour of what you might want to do in your own classroom. You can give pupils a closed choice. Either you do that work now, or you're going to come back and do it at lunchtime. That's your choice, but it's quite a closed choice. You could bracket the behaviour. So you might have 4 pupils sat in a row and 3 are on task and 1 is not. And you might name drop the 3 that are doing the work in the way that you want it done and praise them, but say nothing about the pupil who isn't doing the work. Sometimes that's enough to trigger that pupil into action and to do the work that you're expecting. You can give time pressures in lessons as well. You've got 5 minutes to do this task. You've now got 3 minutes. You've now got 1 minute. But I would say when you use timings, be really clear to stick to it. The minute you say, oh, I've given you 5 minutes, you now need, actually, you know what, you need another 10. You aren't really sticking to the parameters of what you've actually set yourself. You can casually question a pupil. You know, Johnny, and it's always a Johnny, isn't it? How's that work going? Sometimes that's enough for Johnny to realise they aren't doing what they should be doing. There's the classic, which I was taught 20 odd years ago, teacher stare with a raised eyebrow. Sometimes that has an effect. Non-verbal signals like pointing at a pupil and doing a suggestive kind of handwriting gesture can work. Proximity, in other words, getting close to the pupil, not too close obviously, but going up toward a pupil to see what they're doing, to look over their shoulder, to look at their work. Mirroring a pupil. If a pupil's talking loudly, you could mirror that, obviously not with losing control as a teacher, but to make the point that someone's perhaps being too loud. I think being really crystal clear as well, ambiguity is a real issue. I'd like a bit of quiet now is a classic line often used by teachers. What does that actually mean? Private interventions, whereby you go up to a pupil and you speak to them and you're subtle with it, you're not making a public show out of it, but you'll tell a pupil, you know, that they're not engaged with the work, and do they need any help? It can actually help to, redirect a pupil. The other one is surnames. Knowing people's names in general is really, really powerful, but knowing surnames is really, really key, and using surnames. And pupils really like it, I would argue, because it feels very grown up. The other aspect is to stand at the back of a classroom and then to sort of navel gaze the room, and the pupils never know exactly where you stood. So to kind of summarise this brief session about behaviour, and to be fair, we probably could have spent a couple of days on this. Most teachers will react to behaviour, and we need to think quite carefully, quite seriously about being proactive rather than reactive in our approach to behaviour management. Our culture needs to be a proactive one, an explicit one as well, and consistency is absolutely key. We are only as strong as our weakest link, and ultimately, all pupils must receive some form of feedback about their behaviour. Thank you ever so much for listening. I hope that was helpful.
What a whistle-stop tour of how we can change the behaviours within our schools. A lot of timely reminders, and also quite a lot to actually digest. A lot of questions that have been coming through. So I'd like to formally welcome Sam to the E stage. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Sam.
Thank you. Good morning.
First, I just want to say that at the beginning of this session, Sam was actually registering key workers at his school while the webinar was starting. So just goes to show what situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. So thank you so much for giving us your time. I know how precious it is, but I also know that the attendees that are with us today and that will be watching this will also value all the words that you shared this morning. I mean, fantastic. So thank you for joining us, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you ever so much for having me, and thank you to everybody that's obviously tuned in to listen in, and indeed that may well ask questions, so thank you.
Quite a few questions have been coming up. Was there anything that jumped to mind that you want to start off with, Sam?
I mean, one question that came up a couple of times is about the notion of teacher autonomy. When you have routines for learning, what happens to teacher autonomy? How will teachers then buy into what you're trying to achieve if you've got a very clear set of prescriptive routines for learning? And if I take that question, what I've found through my own experience, and indeed through, again, the research that's out there, is that where you do have a really clearly agreed set of routines for learning, teachers actually become more autonomous, because for sake of argument, if there's a set routine to how lessons should start, per se, that teachers should meet and greet pupils, engage in an engaged task, that might be retrieval practice based in nature, and pupils are to sit in a set format. I'm kind of making this up, but I'm not. That becomes habitual for everybody, the teachers and the pupils, that you can then plough your kind of thoughts, your thinking power, your teaching ultimately into actually teaching, as opposed to having to manage behaviour. So the idea behind clearly defined routines is that it actually allows teachers to teach, which actually increases their autonomy as opposed to reducing it. If you're fighting pupils from the off the minute your lesson starts, you're not actually, the core job, which actually is teaching, ceases to be the core job. It becomes one of just sheer classroom management. And then you've got that disparate kind of spread of those teachers that can and those teachers that really struggle. And then you get real inconsistency potentially that it develops across your school. So I would actually argue that routines allow for greater teacher autonomy. And if anybody is in doubt of that, go and visit schools that really have got well-drilled, well-defined routines for learning to see what behaviour looks like. Have a read of the Tom Bennett report that I referenced as well, because Tom visited well over 300 schools, and that was a major finding within his report, that routines for learning make a fundamental difference to behaviour in schools. It's all about being preemptive and being proactive rather than being reactive. I appreciate there is a degree to which we're always going to be reactive to behaviour because we're dealing with human beings, but it's how much we can actually control that within reason.
Thank you for that. Just to remind people, any links that were mentioned, anything that's brought up, we will put those on Twitter as well. I'm sure that you'll be sharing some stuff on Twitter as well, Sam, if that's Okay. Again, there's a whole range of questions there. I'm quite happy to jump in between different topics. I mean, we don't need to keep a thread through it. Stephen, I mean, a really good point. Again, there's a big drive, and there has been for many years, and the importance of parental involvement in terms of creating the culture that you want within your school, and starting with behaviour. So do you think there's a role for schools to work with parents to improve their child's behaviour, and what would this look like?
Yeah, I mean, in the broadest sense, you want parents to obviously buy into what your school culture is about. So thinking about kind of a starting point, your year, let's just say for sake of argument, you're starting with year 7. Then your year 6 prospective parents who are shopping for a school, I think you need to be very clear with parents, very explicit with parents about what your culture and your behavioural expectations are. And ultimately, you're hoping that they will buy into what you're about. So from kind of the bottom up, that helps on that front. Obviously, if you've just taken over a school for sake of argument, you've then got the issue of having to develop and build the buy-in of existing legacy parents. And I think it's explaining to parents, you know, really openly, really honestly, why you are doing what you are doing. What is the purpose behind it? It's like with anything, I would argue, within our profession. If you can explain the rationale, show the evidence, and the intended impact or impact of what you're trying to achieve, you're likely to get more people on board with you. I'm sure there'll be some parents who will ultimately disagree, and you do have to go there. You do have to hold your ground, as a leader, as a head. If you've brought in an initiative, a change that you fundamentally believe in and want to drive within your school. But I do think it is important to work with parents. I think the cautionary aspect with that as well, though, is that we are the experts. And I don't mean that controversially to be at loggerheads with people, but ultimately I wouldn't go to my chair of governors, who happens to be a builder by trade and has his own building business, and tell him how to run that business, because I have no idea. And with the same token, there has to be a degree with which parents actually trust what we say. And I think that's something that's been eroded over time, actually, across the land. I think it's something that we do, not in an aggressive sense, but we do need to reassert that we are the experts. And there is but again, it's back to the reasoning and the rationale. But I would always promote working with parents. I think that's a really powerful thing to do. And again, and ultimately having parents on board is one less, thorn in your side in many regards.
I mean, just to tag on to that, a lot of schools employ the home school contracts. I mean, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a home school contract as well. We had to kind of adapt and refine it from when I started my tenure in the school. And again, if you're new coming in, the issue you're going to have if you change that is that you've got those legacy parents that are going to have to sign a new homeschool agreement, because you may well have changed all the rules potentially. And then you've got the new parents who know no different. I think it's a useful referral point if you do have an issue with a parent who's really challenging you to the nth degree, that you can say, you signed this piece of paper, you've read through the homeschool agreement and what our school is about, and that was what you were signing up to. So it's useful. It can also sometimes be used as a stick to beat you with as well by parents if you've not adhered to the fulfilled part of the homeschool agreement from your end. So you've got to be very careful, I think, what you put in there as well.
Yeah,
give that a lot of thought.
Absolutely. I think what you said, and I think the thread ran all the way through, and a lot of the comments said, was the level of honesty that you've shown, but also that you show towards your students, to your staff, and to parents at home. So all the stakeholders is actually having those honest and frank discussions, and putting the child at the centre and saying, look, how do we best serve the needs of this child and the children within our general community in our schools? And I think that as a starting point, will always serve you well, I think.
Yeah, there's a question about house system. This might be from someone who's visited my school or seen on Twitter that we have a house system, but how do we use that to add to our school culture? Certainly from when I took over my school, we were very keen to get a house system put into place very, very early on. So I joined my school in April 2017, and we had the house system up and running by September of 2017. And I would argue it took about 6 months to really kind of embed it. So within the context of my school, we have 4 houses. They're based around trees. So we've got oak, maple, chestnut and willow. Pupils have a badge that goes on the lapel of their blazers to signify which house they belong to. Sixth formers have a coloured lanyard, as do staff. And I'm one of the few kind of nomads within the school, so there's no kind of bias within the system. But what we've done with ours is to make it call to behave in many regards and to reward what I would describe as the silent majority. I mean, my school, and I've talked about this on various research ed conferences before, was a bit like the Wild West when I joined, but kind of 90 to 95% of the pupils were absolutely fantastic, but incredibly frustrated that a small minority were destroying their lessons, and that the pupils that were doing all the right things were never really getting rewarded for it. So we award pupils house points if they do certain things linked to our values. And if they hit certain thresholds, they'll get a bronze, silver, gold or platinum award. So they get a certificate, they get a badge that goes on the lapel of their blazer, and they get an Amazon voucher and a communication that goes home. And for the most prestigious of those awards, the platinum awards, I personally phone home to tell parents, your child's, done an amazing thing and achieved a platinum award. What we found though, culturally, is that it's shifted the mindset of our pupils to do the right thing, to engage in a community spirit. And then every fortnight, every other Friday lunchtime, our pupils compete with one another in an array of house activities. And it's not just sport-based, it's every subject that has to contribute to that. But that's helped to really drive a real fervour of community spirit across our school, which I think, again, if you're trying to be proactive and thinking about kind of broader routines for a school, I think that's really important. And then we bring our houses together in an assembly sense twice every half term, where the vertical house meets, and it's a platform to celebrate our pupils, which is such an important thing to do. And it culminates in a huge awards evening at the end of the academic year. Unfortunately, this year's been a little bit because of COVID, but it's something we will move back to again once we're back.
I'm going to take a live question, if that's okay with you. I've got Noreen. She delivered the session yesterday, on governance yesterday. Hi, Noreen. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Sam, really enjoyed that, really useful. My question, as you'd expect, relates to governance. Yeah. How can governors help heads like you make behaviour good in their schools? And what would heads like you expect from governors?
Yeah, I mean, if I take my own example as a case in point, when I joined the school I'm at, what I found probably the most useful thing was that with the chair of governors, and she had the time to be able to do this, to be fair, we had fortnightly meetings every Tuesday afternoon for about 2 hours, where for both of us, it was like peeling back the layers of the onion to see what was kind of systemically wrong with the school. And really to have, again, open, honest, frank dialogue, frank discussion with your governing body about where your school's at, what you're trying to achieve, the rationale behind it. Governors being a visible presence within the school at the right points in time. And I don't mean in terms of fabricating a show, but in terms of inviting them in to come and have a look at key stages where you feel you're making progress with what you're trying to achieve, or where you feel you've established a routine. Actually then being tangibly able to see that, I think makes a big difference, especially for when you then meet as a governing body in a governing body meeting. You're not kind of talking in the abstract. You've actually got governors who can say, yeah, I went into school and I saw for 3 hours in a row this level of behaviour and this system or approach in action, and it really does or it really doesn't work.
Thank you for that, Noreen. A really good, as I said, bringing in all the stakeholders in terms of developing the cultures in your school. And I think governance, as those people that hooked in yesterday, is an absolute vital part when it works well. So when you've got an impactful governance, then it really does help the school develop and improve. Mandy, she's asked, you clearly state that restorative practice is not your MO. Do you not feel that it can be incorporated into your ethos? It is a way of diffusing conflict.
When I say it's not our main MO, it's not the main operational mode of dealing with behaviour within our school. We do engage in restorative conversations with pupils and correctional conversations with pupils. I think restorative has a place, but if you overuse it, you're overzealous in your approach with RJ, and I've seen this in previous schools I've worked in. Pupils potentially, after a period of time, realise that actually there is very little that's going to happen to them. And I know that sounds awful, but actually then they tend to test the barriers and push even more. And then the other side, if you rely solely on restorative justice as an approach, is that staff, if they feel they're not being backed up and there isn't a system in place that will allow you to tangibly deal with behaviour, they become disillusioned and they will give up on you. So I think it needs to be part of the mix. It needs to be part of the cocktail. Being very honest again about my school, we deliberately got rid of all punitive sanctions from September of 2017 to Christmas of 2017 when I was in post, because I wanted to rebuild relationships with the pupils. And I wanted the staff to rebuild, more importantly, those relationships before we brought in a punitive sanction system, which was really tiered and really routinized in approach. And it was about carefully timing everything. There's a lot of research around restorative approaches that they've got something between a 6 to 12 month shelf life, if that is the main driver that you use, where behaviour improves and then behaviour will start to decline.
We've got Matthew Cooper. He says, in your opinion, so kind of links with, so getting to the nth degree when things, you haven't been able to nudge the right behaviour in your classrooms and in your school. What activities should students in detention be completing to make it productive, as in reading, homework, detention papers? And then Bess is from New York. She said that reflection letters and what they may do differently to avoid their behaviour. So a bit of a question and a little bit of a suggestion there as well.
I mean, it's completely variable, isn't it, from one school to the next? It's down to, in many regards, with detention, if you have a centralised system, the ideology of the school. I've seen schools where pupils copy out texts, and quite literally they're copying out extracts of inspector calls because the school's view is we want them to know that inside out. I've seen approaches where pupils would engage in homework, and I've seen approaches where pupils will engage with writing a reflection or a letter of apology. Other approaches are where teachers will come down and engage in a conversation with the pupil to try and mend the bridge, so to speak. It's very much down to what your school is about. I don't think there can be a fixed answer to that because it is so pertinent to the school.
And I think that kind of answers in some degree Marian's question, which is to do with centralised detentions. And I think what you've clearly indicated and what you've said throughout is that one, there isn't the silver bullet. There's a collection of approaches that you can take based on your setting, and not all the actions that you take work forever. So you've got to continually review and revise what you're doing, and it will be very much determined by the school that you're in. So I think there's a few questions that are kind of like, use the approach. You really need to know your school and see what works, and don't be afraid to try something, I suppose, as long as it's based on good research. If you try it and it doesn't work, then don't continue doing it,
Absolutely.
So Adrian has, I don't know if you can read that one from Adrian. New heads or new leaders or turnaround schools agree behaviour and culture first. When do leaders move the narrative to teaching and learning, staff, CPD, pupil opportunities, etc.? Does Sam have any advice on when the agenda needs to move on, or doesn't it? The best schools I've seen have set cultures and moved the agenda very quickly. I don't know if that's typical.
Yeah, if I take my own context, so my school was historically one of the longest serving special measures schools in the country. It went to outstanding for a period of time. And then when the advert came out for this particular role that I now assume, I thought I was applying to an outstanding school. Prior to interview, Ofsted came, Ofsted went. They downgraded the school to requires improvement, arguably rightly. The culture, the climate, the ethos of the school and the curriculum were not where they should have been, if I'm going to be kind of kind to the establishment. In terms of what I did, and again, it varies obviously from one context to the next. I spent the first 6 weeks getting to know everybody. I took the view, counters that 100-day approach of going like a speed train, of meeting people, of going out and about, of talking to pupils, of going into departments and faculties to see what goes on in lessons. So I can actually come at things from a really informed standpoint and get a real full kind of 360, I suppose, feel of what the school was actually about, what the strengths were and what the areas for improvement were. Spent the next 7 weeks training everybody in a new model of student care. And year one, if you were to take it from September to September, because I kind of took the summer term as almost like a free hit in many regards to get ready for September, was all about the culture, the climate and the ethos of the school. But equally, it was about putting, as much as we were saying that the teachers were the expert, but putting pupils on a pedestal through the house system that we established. But equally, we were trying to upskill staff with a really refined approach to CPD. We were bringing in SLEs through our Teaching School Alliance to increase expectations and the quality of delivery across the school as well. And I was drip feeding during that first year aspects around a knowledge-based curriculum. The second year in post was about going kind of full throttle with a knowledge-based curriculum, but when I say full throttle, it was kind of launching it in its fullest sense. Even though I'd spent about 15 months training all my middle leaders in what a knowledge-rich curriculum actually meant, but it was actually then to launch it. But even now, kind of 3 years in, that knowledge-rich curriculum is very much in its infancy. This year, the theme that we've gone with is to do the same but better, to slow everything down and to just allow everything to embed, and to build in just 1 or 2 key changes. And then as we move into September, all things being equal, our improvement plan is doing the same, but even better. So it's refining yet again the systems, the processes that we have, the curricular approach that we've got, the knowledge-rich approach that we have, and the more specific approaches that we have as a school. Again, I think it's very much down to the context and the setting that you're in. And that isn't meant as a fudged response. It's just that every school is different. And I've worked in 6 different schools now in my career, and every one of those has been completely different. And you can't take an off-the-shelf kind of package approach from one and supplant it in the next. It doesn't work that way.
And kind of just to wrap that one around, I mean, I know that you'd answered this one, but I think it's worth redressing that one in terms of Sophie had asked a question about visibility. So leadership visibility within schools and whether all the leaders of your school should be visible and in what context and the impact of when they're not. I'll let you answer that one, because I know that's a tough one for a leader who's got 101 different demands on every minute of their day, but also to have that balance between visibility and getting the job done, you know?
It is a difficult one. I think a lot of it's down to the priorities you have as a school. So if I'm expecting my senior team as their head to fit in lots of paperwork for me and answer millions of emails to me and be in endless meetings with me, then we can't be visible. And for me, in my mind, I'm quite a simple person, I suppose, in many regards. I take the view that schools and teaching is actually, it's a very complex thing, but actually it's very, very simple at the same time. And if you get rid of all the gumph and the bump and the white noise that goes around it, the core job, teaching, becomes the core job, and instead of all the other distraction things that kind of take place. So in terms of the approach that we have, in September, we don't have any of our routinized kind of daily meetings that we would normally have as a senior team. So I don't meet with my senior leaders in the day, we do it after school, and my senior leaders don't meet with middle leaders through normal line management. So that for the first month after the summer, and we'll do this post-COVID as well, we are all out and about and in the corridors, every single lesson as a huge presence. And that is very, very deliberate, because we want the school to be settled. We know that after any big holiday like the summer, things become a little bit loose in many regards, and it's part of our rebooting and recalibrating the school at the start of the new year. Then as you go on, we've got a very deliberate SLT rota where there's at least 2, if not 3 of us, and again, appreciate this depends on the size of a senior management team, where we're out and about and in the corridors and in lessons. And we have a very deliberate open classroom door approach as a school. So we just go in and out of rooms. It's not to spy on teachers. It's not to check up on them and to make notes about them. It's to ask them if everything's okay and to see if there are any issues in terms of the culture within the school itself. But through that visibility, we can also see if the routines that we want are actually up and running. And if they're not, it's not about then lambasting staff. It's about we've not trained the staff properly. And I actually take it in the right way, quite personally, if things aren't running in the way that they should be, because I've clearly not conveyed my messages, clearly not trained my staff in the way that I should have done to ensure that those routines that I want are ever present. But I do feel that, you look at some of the top performing schools, their SLT are out and about. There's always a visible presence in the school. And I think the danger is the minute that kind of stops, even with the schools that have got the most secure cultures, things will start to wane and things will start to dip. And thinking about the flow of an academic year, mid-November and early February, in addition to the start of the academic year, are some of the most volatile points of the year. For what, just year in, year out, doesn't matter which school you work in, November and February always seem to be quite challenging for behaviour. So I think it's also knowing those kinds of things to know when you need that increased presence as well.
Definitely. Just a little bit of a broader question. Coffee has asked, so we talk about the culture, but then we add the dynamic of diversity. So students from different backgrounds, different cultures themselves. How does that impact what you're trying to do in terms of behaviour management policies? Does it matter? Is there just one rule and that's it? Or, I mean, we've heard the examples like the school in London about the school uniform issue with the girl with the afro hair, I think it was.
Yeah.
And she'd been sanctioned, and then in the end that obviously was reversed in terms of that it was deemed to be unreasonable. How do you work with that dynamic? Because I mean, we're in Luton here, and we've got a huge range of different cultures, and Northamptonshire has got a varied range as well. So how does a school leader possibly get it right when you've got such a diverse range of students and staff, I suppose, as well?
Absolutely. And again, it goes again back to the context, the setting of your school. What is it you're trying to achieve? Is it legal as well? And that's, really a really important factor. But what is it that you're trying to sweat over with your pupils? If it's an afro haircut, have you got your priorities right? And that's for schools to debate. I'm not going to give a view on that, but it's something to ponder on and think about. For me, in my own setting, it's about, is the school safe? Is it secure? Are teachers able to teach? Are there clearly systemised routines for learning that allow pupils to learn and pupils to thrive? And that allow us then to absolutely celebrate the diverse, because we've got a hugely diverse pupil population, and I think it's amazing. But we can't celebrate that if the school's like a zoo and it's a riot every 2 minutes. So it's down to what you're trying to achieve as a school, I would argue.
Yeah, I think like you're saying, is it safe? Can learning happen in the way that you want it to happen? All those things, then some of those other things, I suppose, become side issues. I suppose, unless they are having an impact, like you say. Jump it to now. Okay, how can we provide active learning tasks for primary students during distance learning sessions? We'll end with that one, I think. And that's from, that's from Nadia. Because you're in an all-through school, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, if I think about the early years curriculum, it's all about learn through play and through exploratory learning. And that's so difficult to do from afar. I think even when we're bringing our early years pupils back, it's difficult with social distancing to explain to pupils, we want you to learn through play, but we want you to keep, X number of meters apart from one another. That's where, and going back to one of those previous questions about building that buy-in with parents, it is important to have that buy-in. No one obviously could have foreseen what's happening now, but I think we've got to be really explicit with parents about what it is we want. And whether that's through very clear, simple instructions that are written, or instructional videos that show a parent, I'm going to make this up, how to make Tracy Island, whatever it might be. I'm showing my age now, but it is making it really, really clear, isn't it, to parents in this current setting. But also it's being realistic as well with what we want parents to do with their child at home. Is it going back to that idea of diversity and the spread that we have in your school, my school, is that idea of building Tracy Island, is that affordable even for a family? Because we're asking them to use X number of different raw materials. You would assume making cupcakes might be quite a simple thing to kind of say, do that with your child. And it does employ a lot of great skills for children and the knowledge of how to make a cupcake. But can a parent afford that as well? So it's something, again, you've got to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we could spend at least another couple of hours going through the questions that are coming through. So what I want to say is thank you, Sam. I know, as I said, everybody's time is precious, but when you're at the helm of a ship at the moment, I think it's even more precious. So thank you so much for your time today and your input today.
Thank you for having me.
Right. End of another session. Do go on to Twitter if you are on there now, if you are on Twitter, and follow us at Chiltern TSA. Join in with the conversation with Melanie Norman, who's doing our Twitter takeover from Cedars Upper. Sam is active, very active on Twitter. So if you've got any questions, I'm sure he wouldn't mind you posing them on Twitter if you've got anything that comes up. Just a reminder about the sessions that we've got coming up. Andrew Cowley We've got who'll be looking at wellbeing and workload. We've got Adrian Rogers on Thursday looking at recruitment and improving staff. I suppose it's looking at retention as well, in terms of how do we maintain our staff body as we move forward. And then we've got, as I said yesterday, the wonderful Dr. Patrice Evans from Chiltern High School for Boys, outstanding school for many years, looking at how do we develop outstanding middle management in terms of heads of department. So that's the week that we have for you. Do go on to our Twitter. All of this is available for you free of charge from Chiltern Teaching School Alliance. Do make use of the time that we are putting forward. Do engage with us. Thank you to all our new followers. Thank you to all the attendees that have not joined us before. Go on to Eventbrite, join in, sign up to any of the sessions that you want to. We have capacity to take as many of you as we are able. So do join us there. So this is me, Arv Cowshaw, hashtag LDeduchat, Leadership Development in Education Online, for another session. Signing off. Thank you for joining us.